Well, now, welcome back. In the studio now, we're joined by Danny Ayalon, senior I-24 News analyst and Israel's former deputy foreign minister, Dr. Anat Hochberg-Marom, an expert on global terrorism, and Meir Javedan Far, lecturer in Iranian studies at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. Thank you all for joining us here as we are in day 45 now of Operation Protective Edge. That number has obviously steadily climbed for us in these editions here. Mr. Ayalon, I'd like to start with you and talking about some of the most recent developments here now. In the last day, we've seen the targeted killings, the successful strikes on these three top commanders, and these, some would say successful, some say not, strike against Mohammed Deif. How significant does that play into the entire arena, not just militarily, but politically as well? What's the impact there, locally and in the conflict?
Well, the impact, of course, is militarily, because I believe Deif and the other two, mainly, were very instrumental in operations, in building their strategy, in operating, in commanding, controlling, and everything else. It's also, of course, political implication with the symbolic issues and all that. And the targeted killing, it seems to be, again, this is the most effective tool against terrorism. And you know that even President Obama is using this in a very, very massive way. People do not know that President Obama is the president who has authorized more targeted killing than any other president before him.
Yemen, Afghanistan,
from
Pakistan,
Yemen to Afghanistan,
yes,
and everything in between. And indeed, Hamas and the ISIS is the same. There's not much difference. So in terms of the international scene, there is much more understanding. I think that the U.S. is certainly more understanding now. I think that there's now patching of relations between Bibi Netanyahu and Obama. And at the end of the day, it seems like the Hamas strategy will not end. If they thought of some long strategy of attrition, it seems like they are losing assets in much more rapid way and in a significant way than Israel does. So we do have the breathing space. We do have the stamina. And this means that when they come, and I believe at the end of the day they will come back to the negotiating table in Cairo, they will have less cards than they did before.
Meir, let's talk about Iran for a moment now. Obviously, an influential player in the region, more so now than perhaps arguably ever before. Maybe you'll disagree with that in the region. How do they play into this? Do they play into this situation? And should they? Should they be somehow brought in on the back channels more than they have been? No,
they shouldn't, because they're not part of this. I don't think even Hamas would actually agree to it, because Hamas has got very close relations with the Qataris. Qatar's house, Khaled Mashal, when he wanted to go to Tehran, the Iranian news website, Tabnak, close to the former Revolutionary Guard commander Mohsen Rezai, called him a charlatan. So Qatar is being very nice to him, and I don't think the Qataris will be very grateful for Iran becoming involved when they've been paying his hotel bills and everything else that's been going on. And actually, Iran is really not a player in this as much as it was before.
Exactly before. Is all that influence gone?
Well, it hasn't. Iran has transferred technology to Hamas, and during the reign of Morsi, when there was chaos in Sinai, there was a lot of weapons being transferred. But you know, with the fall of Morsi, plus what's happening in Syria when Iran turned against Bashar al-Assad, I think the relations between them is nowhere as near as it was. It may improve in the future, but I think Iran is finding that this is maybe actually too much of a hot potato, because if they press on the Hamas thing too much, it may weaken their hands in the nuclear negotiations. Iran now wants to play, especially the government, wants to play nice with the Americans when it comes to the nuclear negotiation, especially Rouhani. And I think this is something that, yes, there's a lot of rhetoric, but Iran actually becoming involved like it was before. With Hamas, with Jihad Islami is something else. They are very much involved with them. But with Hamas, it's not the same as it was before.
Last night, Prime Minister Netanyahu makes clear parallels between the Islamic State militants and Hamas, trying to obviously build a sense of solidarity with the West in this fight against Hamas. How accurate do you think that is, or how important was that analogy to draw?
First of all, we have to understand that Hamas is not global jihad, the global Salafi jihad. We can compare the Hamas against Israel as compared to the global jihad against the U.S., specifically in the Western, generally. We have to build a solidarity among ourselves, among the Western countries, but we have to understand that the Hamas against Israel is only, very small, tiny example of the whole huge threat of the global jihad. It's important to go against the Hamas, but it's only the beginning of what we can have the global terror phenomenon that we have to confront with. It's not only to have the solidarity in Israel, but we have to make a solidarity among Western countries, and to change and to make some changes with our approach against the global jihad. Because it's not enough to say that we have to do something, but we do have to have some very huge changes in perceptions, in even to understand the other entity that are against us. It's not only the ISIS.
Not as clear as perhaps Netanyahu prefers to present it, I guess. But,
right.
Yes, Mayor.
You know, I think what's very interesting is we talk about ISIS. You know, it's amazing how the Middle East it's always fluid. There's all different kinds of alliances being formed. And what I'm about to describe to you is not an alliance, but actually we find ourselves now on the same side as Iran. Because Iran is against ISIS. Israel is against ISIS. But we could say that we're also on the same side as Bashar al-Assad, because Bashar al-Assad is also fighting ISIS. And
Hezbollah is against ISIS.
So, you know, we do have some shared interests, which is interesting. It's complex, but it's amazing that the topography of this, there's so many earthquakes in this region that the geostrategic map, and with all the topographic lines, change constantly.
Is there some kind of
we have to understand also
allegiance with Hezbollah, per se, between Israel and Hezbollah?
I wouldn't say, but Hezbollah fighting ISIS, they're doing our job. You know, Iran fighting ISIS, they're actually doing our job. And this is something that when it comes to Iran and ISIS fighting each other, I think what Prime Minister Menachem Begin said about the Iran-Iraq war, he says, I wish them both the very best of luck. And I think when Iran is fighting ISIS, I think we should really wish them the very best of luck for us, you know, if they're doing the job.
We have also to understand that Hamas is the enemy of the ISIS. Is perceived as an enemy because it just adapted the political process, the political elections, and that's against the global jihad ideology. So that's why the ISIS is against the Hamas.
But I would say, David, although they may differ ideologically, but the goal is the same goal. So I look at them as branches of the same tree, even if they sometimes are, you know, looking
out
at each
to
other.
change world order.
But there are differences among themselves.
Are the assassinations the way to deal with this, though? Do you think that this is a good strategy in this going after the leaders like we've done?
I think we have to take into considerations lots of, as you just mentioned before, lots of ingredients over here. But we have to mention before that this is the local jihad as compared versus the global jihad. This is the Islamic State in Palestinian territories as compared to the collective Ummah or collective caliphate, the Islamic caliphate, which includes 1.5 billion people around the world. It's not only, you know, to mention that territorially, but to go over and to go into it, it's a lot. It's much more complex and complicated issue than to say it's, you know, just to make a parallel, to make the...
If I may simplify this, and in politics you have to simplify things, I would say that they have the same goal. They agree on the what. Maybe they differ on the how.
They have different why. Okay, they have different, absolutely different. To have the question why is absolutely different here.
But it's the same objective.
Does Hamas say wants to take over the world?
No, not at all.
But
as far as
ISIS,
they are against the national Israel. They against Israel is a Zionist entity, but they're
one wants to take over the world. One wants to wipe out Israel.
Just a moment. I would like to focus on the assassinations here, specifically assassination of these 3 Hamas officials last night. It certainly reignited the controversy surrounding targeted killings, a method adopted by Israel in recent decades, but raises moral, political, and legal questions. Y24 News reporter Uri Shapiro has more. Anat Hochberg standing by in Ashkelon. Now back in studio. Mayor, let's talk about these regional players again now, specifically Hezbollah, who's built their arsenal similarly to what we've seen Hamas employ. Now with the rockets, this has been a major focus of their strategies to build up their missile and rocket arsenal. Tunnels we maybe don't know about yet. We'll talk about that in a moment. But is the lack of activity in the north? Some have expected that with the flare-up in the south here, there was going to be more rocket fire from the north, from Hezbollah, some sort of provocation, something to complicate the Israeli strategy. It's been quiet. Is that related to what's going on with ISIS in Iran, or what's behind that, in your opinion?
It's related more to the Iran nuclear program. Hezbollah's most important job for Iran is to act as a deterrent against the possible Israeli military strike against Iran's nuclear installations. To be an effective deterrent, Hezbollah needs to be strong. If it becomes weak, becomes involved in a war against Israel, then its deterrence posture is not going to be strong, and it won't be able to do its job, which is to deter Israel from possibly attacking Iran's nuclear infrastructure. ISIS is actually, it's a different thing for Iran. Iran views ISIS as a big threat, but what to do about it has been very interesting. One of the solutions has been to change the government of Iraq, to change Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. It now emerges that in Iran, the head of the Revolutionary Guard Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, apparently he didn't want Maliki to be changed. He wanted Maliki to stay. And from experts who visit Iran, we understand that he's the closest person to Ayatollah Khamenei. But on the other hand, there were other members of the government and the regime who said, no, to save Iraq, we need to make a compromise, even if it means having Abadi, who's close to the Sunnis and the Saudis as well. And they sent somebody as the head of the Supreme National Security Council, Shamkhani. And what we saw is that that the Revolutionary Guard actually lost the argument, and Nouri al-Maliki was changed. And I think this is very interesting. It affects the balance of power in Iran, government versus the security apparatus. But at the end of the day, when it comes to Hezbollah, its biggest job is just deter Israel.
Again, not coming to the rescue of Hamas or taking advantage of the situation with Israel diverted towards the south. Is this a sign that Hezbollah as well maybe doesn't have the capabilities to take on a multi-front fight, as they are still embroiled in the conflict in Syria against ISIS, among others, up there? Do you read that from the situation, that perhaps Hezbollah doesn't have the ability at this point to wage a conflict with Israel?
I don't think they don't have the ability or capabilities to confront Israel as well. I think they wait for the moment, very specific moment, in order to confront or to attack Israel more specifically. But we have to take into consideration the idea that behind their attacks, ISIS is the most brutal, the most aggressive terrorist organization over here that want to influence public opinion. But on one hand, they want to incite widespread fear and paranoia. That's the way they influence the public opinion, the people themselves. On the other hand, they use the weaknesses of their, let's say, enemies. They're minorities. Nobody is against them. Nobody can come over against them or to attack them. And that's the way to utilize the weaknesses of your enemies once they don't see anybody in their area to confront with them. And the West as well is not. It's not enough to have the to bomb them or to the airstrikes of the U.S. It's too little, too late. I think it's like to fly over the I don't know what it calls, but it's not enough, and it's not any coherent strategy against the ISIS. We have to do a big and a huge change over here in order to confront with them.
Well, now, speaking of confronting them, the international community and many players involved in this, how does a coalition get established to really face off against this threat? How does the international community, in a way, come together to stem the tide of what's taking place?
Well, first of all, galvanizing a like-minded states as an alliance. There are many who share interests and, of course, ideas and others. But those who say that the terrorism of today is just like pirates of the 16th, 17th centuries, I think it's a good comparison. How was the piracy ended when the global or the marine superpowers at the time got together and fought them in the high seas, but that was not enough? As much significant was to deny them safe haven and ports if they couldn't resupply and rest. And this is the problem, that there is no real terrorism coherence, counterterrorism, whether it's a charter, whether it's any kind of UN instrument. Only if countries that give money to terrorism and harbor and give shelters to terrorism, if they are put on the same level as terrorists and risking their own interests, only then we can dry the swamp, as they say.
So you think it's a way to undercut much of the ideology that fuels these movements by removing their actual monetary and support base.
Absolutely, follow the money. Absolutely. So as long as the Qataris finance, whether it's ISIS or Hamas or whatever, it is a problem, and there is no recourse. There is no actually price that the Qataris pay. If the U.S., the Europeans, and others would really put the pressure on Qatar, on Saudis, or some kind of charity funds, on Iran, I think then it could make a big difference. And then also you have to deny them safe haven, whether in Syria, whether in Iraq, whether it's in Somalia, whether it's in Chad or Nigeria or wherever. And you have to have basically an international task force to do that.
Can I just make a point here regarding ISIS? That's Danny talked about the Arab countries stopping supporting ISIS. There was a poll done by a British poll company, ICYM, if I'm not mistaken, for Russia Today. Now, we all know what I think Russia Today, it's a, you know, et cetera, but it's a British company that did it. It's a very reputable one. It found, Danny, that 20% of French people support ISIS. 20%. This is France.
The Muslim.
I don't know if it. I don't.
I'm
it
sure
didn't
it's the
say.
Muslim
It didn't.
French, yeah.
But still, this is in France. This is people. I'm going to write a blog about it tonight, and I'll send
That's
it
the
around.
problem of Europe. Is
There
all
are
this,
thousands come from Europe.
This is
from the UK.
These are people who live in a democratic society, one of the most democratic societies in the world.
But it's not surprising, David. You know that thousands of Europeans go and join ISIS, whether they come from
Which we've
Germany
seen this
or
week
France.
with the executioner here, the executioner of this
So
journalist.
the problem is not confined to the Middle East. This is a problem that's also from
And the
from
sooner
Europe.
the Europeans understand it, is the better for them, not just for us.
Yeah.
So right now, the terrorism, I would say, the global jihad, is enjoying the fact that there is no unity of purpose and not unity of understanding at this point. At some time, I believe, when push comes to shove, there will have to be some kind of a coalition, and you bring in the Russians. The Russians also suffer from terrorism in Chechnya, the Chinese as well. So only if you bring all these powers together with an international instrument that should have been designed by the UN, we can do it.
We're talking about drawing up the resources here. How significant is the resource base or pool for the organizations such as ISIS now? That we know they've essentially extorted much of the funds from the regions that they've conquered, but and received some other state support perhaps here. But how significant are the resources?
They are very important. We have to understand that they want to not only to use these capabilities and resources, they want to terrorize the people all around. Either there are Sunnis or Shias or any minorities like Christian or whoever.
And we've certainly seen there's no room for minorities.
Right. Whoever they are, who do not perceive the Islamists they are from the 7th century. And they also want to cause disputes among minorities, amongst in the Western countries. That's what they want, and that's why they threat or incite the widespread fear and paranoia in order to weaken or victimize the minorities, and to cause themselves to become the larger or the stronger player in the play around the place. Because if we take it in a very wide perspective, we can see that this is one of the threat is a lot larger than Al Qaeda. Okay, if we just compare between Al Qaeda,
they have territory today.
Right, they have large territories. 30% out of Syria, 30% of Iraq, and it's going to be larger. If they go to Jordan or to Lebanon or Turkey as well, it's going to be a lot larger if they are going to weaken and to weaken a lot more the minorities.
We're talking about the strategies here now employed by these organizations, but the tunnels discovered running under the Israel-Gaza border came as a surprise to most Israelis. Well, now residents of Israel's border with Lebanon are wondering whether Hezbollah is employing the same method along Israel's northern border with Lebanon. Well, I-24 News correspondent Michal Livon, she went this week to the northern border and came back with this report. Mr. Ayalon, talking about this concept of attrition now that's been put out there, that this thing could just continue on some sort of level where each side wearing each other out. Obviously, the Israeli arsenal is massive. Gaza, Hamas has limited resources, yet one can't help but look at the actual economic equation taking place here now. The cost of these rockets being fired, the cost of building these rockets that are being fired into Israel versus, say, the cost of each Iron Dome missile that's shot into the sky, the staggering difference in the investment that's taking place and the cost of waging this campaign, just financially, how significant is that right now within Israel?
Well, most of the cost to the GDP is not because of the direct financing of the military equipment. This is something which is very bearable, but it's the denied income and investments, mainly in the tourism area. But still, you know, we can, so far, it's been affecting maybe 1% of our GDP. This is not something that can really dampen the Israeli economy, maybe a little bit less growth this coming year, but it's not something which is serious. But I don't think that we and the Israeli government is prepared for attrition. It is true that they may have only 1,500 rockets left, but they have many, many of these mortars, which is the short range, and are threatening, of course, the Gaza area, and nobody in Israel will tolerate that. So I think that the ground operation is very much on the table if there is no resumption of talks in Cairo within the next 2-3 days.
Well, let's shift the discussion here a little for all of us here, but again, start with you, Mr. Ayalon. Talking about the role of the United States here now, and all the regional players that we've mentioned here, from Qatar to Egypt, specifically here, who seem to, at least in the last week, be some of the most influential states involved in the current situation, aside from Israel and Hamas in Gaza now. Should or could the U.S. be leveraging their influence more on Qatar, on Egypt right now, in order to perhaps stop the power interplay between these states and make something actually happen? Should the U.S. have a stronger role there?
Absolutely. And if there is a real focus here and a greater purpose, it could be done. And quite frankly, I do not know why the United States didn't pull its weight again vis-a-vis Qatar. You know, Qatar is very much dependent on the United States for strategic. You know, there is the largest base in the Gulf. American base is in Qatar. Qatar just bought $11 billion of American equipment. So maybe this could be
Egyptians as well, with a massive input to their economy and their military.
But this also, you know, can be used both ways. But certainly, Qatar has been very, very distracting. Turkey, also the U.S. vis-a-vis Turkey. Turkey is pretty much responsible.
NATO member ally.
Yes, and the mastermind of the coup, the attempted coup against Abbas in the West Bank, it sits in Turkey. Turkey is actually an ideological, the AKP, Erdogan's party, is an ideological brother of Hamas. So the U.S. has a lot to do here and rethink its strategy, and also how to really pull its strings to do to make sure that if Qatar and Turkey, if they're not instrumental in being proactive and helping, at least they should stand still and not do damaging policies against us.
Is the power struggle between these nations now, if you will, a tug of war taking place between Turkey, Qatar, Egypt specifically here, is that now distracting from the conflict between Israel and Hamas? Is that making it more difficult to come to some sort of a ceasefire or agreement, do you think?
I think we just totally agree with Danny Ayalon. I think it's very important to be involved in something which is absolutely opposite and destructive. Just you can sit aside and not do anything, but don't do harm. At least, you know, if you want to take a part, so be involved and help as much as possible in order to help our fragile Middle East, but don't do harm. And to look at the whole picture over here, it's a big picture that could be, you know, changed from day to day. We cannot. It's hard to predict what will be, but at least we have to have a mutual interest here is to halt and to confront with the ISIS, but at least to halt them not to proceed their own way.
Certainly a complex issue right now. So many players involved. But more about this power struggle. How do you see it, man?
I think one point I'd like to add to what Danny said about Qatar is you have to remember that Qatar is also important in America's Afghanistan strategy. America's planning to withdraw all of its forces from Afghanistan this year. Qatar has played a crucial role in being a mediator between the United States and the Taliban. There's apparently a Taliban delegation that lives in Qatar.
I don't know essentially an embassy.
I don't know if their neighbors, Mr. Mashal, I don't know. But you know, this U.S. Sergeant Bergdahl who was released, that was done with Qatar's help, and I think the Americans are very grateful for that. So
I'm
I think
not so sure. It was found that he was actually a renegade.
Certainly a lot of criticism leveled against him.
For the president,
perhaps too soon.
But in any case, you know, the Qataris were instrumental, and for America, it's, you know, they are actually a player. The Qataris really know how to make themselves indispensable to the United States, and the way they are going at it, I think, as much as they are a very negative player, very negative, they're also supporting ISIS. Apparently, according to a German MP, they're also supporting ISIS. As bad a player as they are making themselves indispensable. So as much as we should put pressure on them, it's not easy.
Now, Qatar again, coming back to Qatar, which hosting Khalid Mashal, again putting the pressure on against the Egyptian proposal now again. Are they the central player, if you could say? Obviously, Egypt has managed these negotiations going on, but has it become obvious in some way that they are actually the ones calling the shots in this situation?
I don't think they're the major one. I think they're one of the majors, but if we take into consideration Sisi in Egypt, he's one of, I think, is even a lot more important than the Qatar itself.
Despite his sort of position as an enemy of Hamas?
He is the enemy of Hamas. He just took out the Muslim Brotherhood out of law, and he took Hamas out of law in Egypt. But we have to take into consideration that we have a treaty, you know, agreement since the 80s, and we have to have a mutual interest with Egypt is much more important for Israel.
The fight against terrorism, against the Muslim Brotherhood?
Absolutely.
So that's a central theme, that, in other words, the Egyptians and the Israelis can share in this conflict? Can
share in, mutual interest as well as Jordan, in order to become a lot stronger and to look stronger in South Sinai, and even in our eastern border with Jordan. It's a lot more important, as I can understand it from my point of view, as compared to Qatar. So although we have to take it into consideration that they have tons of money, tons of dollars that can influence what's going on here, but it's not enough. What
are the prospects, in your opinion, of the Egyptians getting involved militarily in the Gaza Strip, in this conflict at some level?
I think they are going to be involved. They halted already the Hamas as well as the Salafists in Egypt. I think they're going to take a very major, very important role here.
Well, absolutely. Again, and Mayor, again, the Qatar, the power struggle, not just against Egypt in this role, but you have to look towards Iran now, too. You mentioned them supporting ISIS now, as ISIS perhaps the main antagonist against Iran in the region there, and stopping Iran's ambitions with everything they've accomplished in Iraq since the U.S. has withdrawn now. Again, is Qatar, in your opinion, is Qatar the central player here, being in the middle of all these situations, being involved now in all these situations?
When it comes to Hamas, they are. I think also they've pushed Iran. There's also another dispute between Iran and Qatar. There's a major gas field, the South Pars field, which is supposed to be shared between Iran and Qatar, but apparently Qatar is taking more than half of the share of the gas from there, and the Iranians are not too happy about that. I think, look, when we talk about Iran, everybody knows Khamenei. There's many Khameneologists in Israel and everywhere else. Doesn't too many people in Israel know who's the new emir of Qatar?
The son.
What's his name?
He's 35 years old.
We don't know. That's the thing. We should also
know his name.
Right.
No, what I understand that he is an Islamist much more than his father. He was actually was going into Islamist schools, so he is much more extreme than his father.
Does the U.S. turn a blind eye on much of this?
Yes, absolutely.
Because of the mutual relationships
Absolutely.
Right. That's the thing. We should study this guy. I think a little, you know, with Iran, we have so much focus. God knows, you know, I spend so much of my time trying to decipher what Khamenei says, the text within the context of what he said and what it relates. We have to also see what the new Emir Al-Thani, what he has to say. You know, where is he going with Qatar? And maybe, you know, maybe in Israel, if, you know, we talked to them before, they used to have a representative office here till 2004, if I'm not mistaken, 2002. Perhaps we should try to speak with them again, as difficult as it may be. I know I'm shooting in the dark here, but you know, the Qataris, the difference between Qatar and Iran is that Qatar is willing to talk. At the end of the day, the Iranians won't even be seen as the same room as Israel.
So it's a positive sign.
Look, they're going to host the World Cup, for God's sake. You know, you can't be so much of an isolationist.
Pressure huge there.
Right.
Thank you very much. Time running out on our edition here. Anat Hochberg-Marom, thank you very much. Meir Javadon and Danny Ayalon. I appreciate all of you participating in our special edition coverage here. Again, day 45 now of Operation Protective Edge here in Israel against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Well, thank you for joining us here. I'm David Matlin, coming to you from the Jaffa Port in Israel. That's all for tonight.